Chioma hid in the bush in fear and horror. Her legs were shaking and her heart was beating very fast. She was confused and didn't know what to do. It was a cold night, yet beads of sweat were dripping down her forehead. Chioma watched as Samuel, Ikenna's uncle, and Toba stood over the body of Ikenna, her best friend and first love. Ikenna was lying on the ground with a knife stuck in his stomach. His face was turned towards Chioma. His eyes were opened and tears were slowly flowing out of them. He tried to call out to Chioma to help him, but his lips couldn't move. Chioma shifted her gaze from Ikenna to Samuel and Toba, who looked as if they were arguing about something. If we throw him into the river, his body would resurface after some days and everyone would know that he was murdered. Yes, but if we tie him to a very big stone, his corpse will be stuck under the river and no one will ever find out. No one must know of this. It has to be a secret between the both of us, a secret we must take to the grave. Chioma watched them from where she hid in the bush as they carried the body of Ikenna and tied it to a very big stone, before they placed it in a canoe and paddled to the deep part of the river. When they were far enough, they threw his body off the canoe and watched it sink. Chioma knew that this was the best time for her to escape, so she ran as fast as her legs could carry her from where she hid to her father's house. When Chioma got home, she was breathing very hard. She met her father outside the compound, reading a newspaper and listening to songs from the local radio. Her stepmother was at the corner of the compound preparing dinner. "Where have you been, this stubborn girl? Come and pound this cocoyam so I will finish cooking in time." Chioma went to where her stepmother was and took the pestle and started pounding. But her hands were trembling. The sight of what she previously witnessed couldn't leave her thoughts. She was traumatized by her discovery. Her stepmother looked at her and in anger, she slapped Chioma and warned her, "If you don't pound this cocoyam well, then be ready to go to bed without eating tonight. You this lazy and unfortunate child." Chioma tried her best to lift the pestle up and started pounding the cocoyam because she didn't want to go to bed hungry. But as she was pounding the cocoyam, she heard the voices of Mr. Samuel and Mr. Toba, the two men she had caught earlier, throwing her best and only friend into the river. Chioma became more scared and terrified because she felt those two men had seen her in the bush and came to kill her too. She started sweating and began to panic. "Chi Chi," Mr. Samuel said, as he was fond of calling her. Mr. Samuel was a very close friend of Chioma's father. He was a teacher in the community primary school where Chioma and the other children in the village attended, so everyone respected him. While Mr. Toba was a butcher who sells meat in the market and was also a very close friend of Chioma's father, who was a hunter. Mr. Toba often helped Chioma's father to sell his meat at the market for a very good price. Good evening, sir," Chioma stammered, her hands shaking. Mr. Samuel patted Chioma on her back and asked her to be a good girl and an obedient daughter. Then the two men went to sit with Chioma's father to discuss. Chioma heaved a deep sigh, knowing that they did not come for her. But she was still curious as to what they were discussing with her father. "Is it possible that my father is aware of what they did?" Chioma asked herself, but she took the thought off her mind and continued pounding the cocoyam. The next day at school, Chioma sat alone on the desk. Ikenna was her seatmate and best friend, so they always sat together. During the first break, an assembly was called for all the pupils to gather at the school compound. Then Mr. Samuel climbed up the podium. "It has come to my notice that Ikenna ran away from home yesterday morning and has not returned since then. His mother is very worried and scared that something may have happened to him. Please, if you have any information regarding his whereabouts, come straight to my office and inform me. And if he is hiding in any of your houses, please tell him to return home. His mother has promised not to beat him. Is that understood? The whole pupils chorused, "Yes, sir," and marched back into their classrooms. While Chioma was going back to her classroom, she saw the mother of Ikenna, Mrs. Ogechi, seated in front of the principal's office, crying her eyes out, and she felt pity for the poor woman. Mrs. Ogechi was the wife of one of the wealthiest men in the village. Her husband owned the community school and many other buildings in the village. However, Mrs. Ogechi was blessed with only one child, whom she named Ikenna. A few years after she gave birth to Ikenna, her husband died mysteriously, making Ikenna the sole heir to his wealth. But Ikenna's uncle, Mr. Samuel, was very greedy. He wanted his brother's wealth for himself. A few months after his brother's death, he approached Mrs. Ogechi and asked her to marry him, so he would be the automatic owner of all that his brother had. But Mrs. Ogechi refused. He did all he could to convince her to be his wife, but Mrs. Ogechi stood her ground, so he gave up. After school that day, Chioma was restless. The event she had witnessed was disturbing her. She felt the urge and need to tell someone, and she knew she couldn't meet Mr. Samuel because he was the culprit. So she decided she would meet Mrs. Ogechi and narrate all that she saw that night. When Chioma was done with all her house chores, she sneaked out of the house to Mrs. Ogechi's compound. When she got there, she met Mrs. Ogechi seated at the front of the house, but there were other people seated with her, consoling her for her missing son. Among the people seated with her were Toba and Ikenna's uncle, Mr. Samuel. But Chioma couldn't turn back because they had already seen her, so she went into the compound and greeted the elders that were seated within. Immediately, Mrs. Ogechi set her eyes on Chioma. She stood up and grabbed Chioma's clothes and started crying bitterly. "You were his best friend. Tell me what happened to my son. Where is my son? Find my son for me," Mrs. Ogechi said with tears streaming down her eyes. The women around held her and loosened her grip on Chioma's clothes, and one of them yelled at Chioma to leave the compound immediately. "Are you not aware that your presence will always remind her of Ikenna, her lost son? Don't you ever set your foot in this compound again," one of the women warned Chioma. Chioma left the compound feeling deeply heartbroken. She broke into tears as she walked back home. There was no one she could trust with the truth. Chioma was the only child of her father. This was because her mother passed away while she was giving birth to Chioma. After her mother's death, her father got married to someone else. Her stepmother started maltreating her, and her father wasn't bothered because he hated Chioma. He blamed her for the death of his beloved wife. Chioma had no friends except Ikenna. They were very close, and she could tell Ikenna everything about herself. So this deeply broke her heart. Chioma felt guilty by being unable to say anything despite knowing the killers of her best friend. She considered going to the police station, but she felt they wouldn't believe her. Besides, who would believe the words of a teenager over that of a grown adult? She also thought about telling her father, but they weren't close, and the possibility that her father might be a culprit as well bothered her a lot. Chioma was one of the best pupils in her class, and her class teacher, Mrs. Emere, loved her very much. Mrs. Emere always encouraged Chioma to take her studies seriously, no matter what she was facing in life. As Chioma was walking home, she saw Mrs. Emere coming from the opposite direction. She quickly cleaned her tears and greeted Mrs. Emere. Mrs. Emere looked at her with a smile and asked her how she was doing. "I'm doing fine," Chioma lied, but deep within her, she needed someone she could trust with the truth. When Mrs. Emere walked past, Chioma began contemplating whether to tell Mrs. Emere about what she saw that night, but she wasn't sure if she could trust her. The next day at school was the general test for the class. Chioma couldn't read because her heart was disturbed. After they had finished the test, her performance was very poor. Mrs. Emere noticed this and knew that something must be wrong with Chioma. Chioma was always top of the class, followed by Ikenna. So it came as a surprise that she scored just 1 mark out of 20 marks. After school that day, Mrs. Emere asked Chioma to stay back when the other children had gone home. She sat alone with Chioma and asked her like a mother, "Chioma, what is wrong? You did very badly in your test. What is the matter?" Chioma wanted to lie at first, but she looked at Mrs. Emere's face and saw how concerned she was. "You can trust me, Chioma. I hope you know that," Mrs. Emere assured her. After contemplating for a while, Chioma excused herself and went to close the door to the classroom. Then she drew closer to Mrs. Emere and said, "I know what happened to my best friend Ikenna. I know the people that killed him. I witnessed his death with my 2 eyes." Mrs. Emere was shocked at first. She felt Chioma was joking or trying to play a prank on her. But she instantly believed Chioma when she started weeping seriously. She patted Chioma on the back and asked her, "How? Where? When?" Chioma looked left and right to be sure no one else was listening. Then she narrated all that she witnessed that night to Mrs. Emere. On the evening that Ikenna was killed, the 2 of them had agreed to meet at the river bank when it was sunset. It was their usual meeting place, away from the villagers. But when she got there that evening, she saw Mr. Samuel and his friend, Toba, standing at the river bank. She quickly hid in the bush so they wouldn't see her. Children had been warned severally to stay away from the river when it was late, so Chioma was scared that they would punish her if she was caught. From where she hid, she saw Mr. Samuel and Toba talking to Ikenna. She was worried that Ikenna was in trouble and would be punished. But she got the shock of her life when Toba handed Mr. Samuel a knife with which he stabbed Ikenna in cold blood. Then they tied his corpse to a big stone and dumped his body in the middle of the river. By the time Chioma finished narrating the incident, she was deeply in tears. Mrs. Emere held her close to herself and tried to console her. "You are safe, I promise. No one would harm you," Mrs. Emere assured Chioma. Then she warned Chioma not to tell anyone about what she saw for her own safety. Afterwards, she accompanied Chioma home and instructed her once again to keep it to herself. When Mrs. Emere got home, she was bothered and confused. She didn't know what to do or who to meet, but she needed to be sure that what Chioma said was true, because the penalty for false accusation was severe and she didn't want to be implicated. The next day, during school hours, Toba came to visit Mr. Samuel in the school. Mrs. Emere saw him entering Mr. Samuel's office, so she decided to pull a dangerous stunt. She sneaked to the window of the office and began to eavesdrop on their conversation. "The deed has been done, and no one else would ever find his body. All that is left now is my brother's wealth. But his wife is still alive. How do we gain access to his wealth? I don't think I can wait for the elders to give us the right to his wealth since their only heir is missing. Then what do you suggest? I think we should kill Mrs. Ogechi as well. If we do this, then you are automatically the owner of everything." Mrs. Emere was shocked. She couldn't believe her ears. She quickly pulled out her phone and started recording their conversation. Mr. Samuel said, "Don't you think that would be suspicious? We killed my brother less than 6 months ago. Then his son went missing mysteriously. Don't you think people will suspect foul play if the wife should die as well?" "It happens all the time," Toba replied. "People would say she killed herself due to grief and pain that she was going through." Mrs. Emere was getting exhausted where she stood. She tried to adjust her leg to position herself properly, and she mistakenly kicked a can. This caught the attention of the 2 friends, and they quickly ran to the window to check if anyone was there. Fortunately, Mrs. Emere was able to run away before they would see her. When she went back to the class, she was speechless. She knew instantly that Chioma was saying the truth, and she decided that those two men would be exposed. After school that day, Mrs. Emere went to the king of the village and reported what she heard. She also played the recording of their conversation to convince the king of her words. The king was very angry and furious. He called on his guards to summon Mr. Samuel, Toba and Chioma and Mrs. Ogechi to the palace. Then he asked them to tell the truth about what happened to Ikenna. The two men denied knowing what happened to Ikenna and also swore on their lives that they were unaware of how he got missing. The king called on Chioma in front of the whole elders and told her to say what she saw. Chioma was afraid at first, but the king promised her that she was safe. Yet Chioma was still terrified of the two men. However, when Mrs. Emere assured her that she could freely speak, Chioma narrated all that happened that evening. The two men were shocked to hear all that Chioma said, yet they still denied her words. To prove her words right, the king sent some fishermen to the river with Chioma and asked her to show them where exactly they dumped Ikenna's corpse. The fishermen dived into the river, and in a matter of minutes, they recovered his decaying and bloated corpse. Mrs. Ogechi couldn't contain her tears. She started weeping seriously, trying to carry the decomposing corpse of her son. But the guards held her, and the women who gathered tried to console her. Mr. Samuel and Toba were arrested for their crimes, and they confessed to killing Ikenna's father and the son just to inherit his wealth. They were sent to prison for life, and Chioma was given a scholarship by the king to study to any level of her choice in any country she desired. Chioma stopped living with her father and stepmother and started living with the king, who adopted her as a princess. The moral lesson of this story reminds us to know that it is wise to strive for your own wealth instead of being greedy and envious of another person's wealth. It would push you to do unimaginable things just to be like them. It is good to have friends that will always look out for you no matter what. Always pay attention to the words of children, no matter how naive they may sound, because in every rumor there is an atom of truth. Be mindful of the people you trust. Your best friend can be your worst enemy.